Well, I think we can get started. Thanks so much for coming and welcome to this session of the Technology, Economics, and Governance Working Group at the Hoover Institution. Today, we're very happy to welcome Amy Zegart, who's co-chair of the working group, and she's going to speak about her new, truly amazing and informative book called Spies, Lies, and Algorithms: Why U.S. Intelligence Agencies Must Adapt or Fail. The subtitle is important: Why U.S. Intelligence Agencies Must Adapt or Fail. It was just out a couple of days ago, Princeton University Press. You're welcome to get whatever format you want. It's a terrific book. Amy is, of course, the Morris, Arnold, and Nona Cox Senior Fellow at Hoover and a Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute. I just learned she was a native of Louisville, Kentucky. She didn't go to high school in Louisville, but that's the other thing. She got her BA from Harvard and her PhD from Stanford. I think this book is amazing. It's based on 30 years of extraordinary experience, including 1993 service to the National Security Council, and it goes on from there. So our format will, Amy will start off with an opening, a review, a summary of current events and past events, for sure. The history is so important. If you have questions, raise your mechanical hand or signal in any other ways. We're anxious to hear your commentary. So let's go. Let's go, Amy. You're welcome to start.
Great. Thanks so much, John. It is like a real pleasure to be able to present this book to this group, the Technology, Economics, and Governance group. I'm so delighted to be working with you, John, in this group. And he even allowed me to say we can play by political science rules in this presentation, so I can finish the presentation before the questions come. So I really appreciate that. It's really a special treat to give this talk here, and I look forward to all your questions and comments. What I wanted to do was really craft this talk around the issues that are of particular interest to this group. So really focusing on the new technology piece. I'm happy to go into history, but I want to focus a lot on how emerging technologies are really challenging intelligence. So let me start by sharing with all of you a story that happened as I was actually finishing the book that really illustrated the power of technology in changing the intelligence landscape. So this happened over July 4th weekend in 2020. At 2 a.m, a fire breaks out in Iran. And the flames are so bright from this fire that they're detected by a weather satellite from space. Now, Iran's Atomic Energy Organization released the photo that you see in the slide. And you can see the damage to this building looks pretty small. It's only in one corner of the building. And the Atomic Energy Organization calls the building an industrial shed, hence the quotes, that was under construction. And it says that the damage was limited and the fire was just a small incident, right? So really downplaying the news. What happens next? Well, two people, one named David Albright, the other named Fabian Hines, decide to get to work. Now, the important thing about these two gentlemen is that they don't work for the US government. They don't hold security clearances. They're non-governmental, non-proliferation researchers. And so what David Albright and Fabian Hines do is they use commercially available satellite imagery, Google Earth, geolocation tools, and other publicly available information. And they quickly conclude that Tehran is lying, that this is not an industrial shed under construction. It is a nuclear centrifuge assembly facility at Natanz, one of Iran's most important nuclear facilities. And the fire isn't a small fire, it was a large fire with extensive damage, most likely caused by an explosion and possibly the result of sabotage. They go on Twitter. By 8 a.m, the Associated Press is carrying their analysis. By afternoon, it's a major story in the New York Times, again, citing these two non-governmental researchers. By evening, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is asked about this analytic argument and asked whether, in fact, his government was responsible for sabotaging the industrial shed in Tehran. All of this happened in the course of a single business day. All of it happened with open source intelligence or publicly available information, and all of it involved people not in US intelligence agencies. That's the new world of open source intelligence. And just so you can see a different picture of the same building, here's a satellite photograph. Again, commercial satellite imagery taken. You can see the date on there, July 4th. That was part of David Albright's subsequent analysis. And from the aerial view, you can see much more extensive damage to that building, right? So more like 3/4 of the building affected by the fire, for a different view from above. So this is a dramatically new world for intelligence agencies, where spying isn't just for governments anymore, and where secrets don't actually convey as much as they used to. There's a lot more insight available from openly available information. So just a couple of examples. In 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine the last time, some of the best intelligence didn't come from secrets, it came from selfies. These were photographs taken by Russian soldiers and posted on social media for their family and friends to see, with Ukrainian highway signs in the background and timestamps on those photographs. So great intelligence coming from social media. When we had the bin Laden raid in his compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, the Pakistani military didn't see our SEAL team coming, but a local IT consultant who lived in the neighborhood did. He heard some strange noises and he ended up live tweeting the entire bin Laden operation, right, carrying it on Twitter. So what I find in the book is that a whole host of emerging technologies, from the internet, artificial intelligence, the proliferation of commercial satellites and their capabilities, these technologies are profoundly changing how the intelligence enterprise works. So I want to talk about this new world and delve a little bit more deeply into nuclear issues in particular. But before I do that, I want to spend a little bit of time on the old world of intelligence and how it operates, just to level set a little bit. Now, we all know spying's been around forever. Espionage is a core part of tradecraft, statecraft, trade and war and diplomacy. The oldest surviving intelligence tablets I learned were chiseled on clay tablets 3,000 years ago. But what I found in my research, and the reason I wrote this book, is that most people actually don't know much about intelligence at all, and they don't know about how US intelligence agencies operate. I conducted national surveys, thanks in part to the assistance of Doug Rivers and YouGov in 2012 and 2013. And I found Americans didn't know much about what was going on, and what they did learn, they learned from spy-themed entertainment. And just to give you one example, in 2013, in the midst of all the press coverage of the Edward Snowden revelations, Snowden stealing extensive files from the National Security Agency and then releasing them before leaving for Hong Kong and then Moscow, I did a survey in the midst of all this and found that 3/4 of Americans either didn't know what the National Security Agency did for a living or got it wrong. So all of this is taking place against a background of real public ignorance. I also found there are more powdered milk experts in Congress than there are intelligence experts in Congress. That's true, because the dairy caucus gathers people from dairy states, and so they have to know a lot about powdered milk, but there's no dairy state equivalent for intelligence. And so very few members of Congress walk in the door an intelligence expert. And just to beat up on my own field, political scientists don't study intelligence either. So I actually counted up the number of articles in the top 3 disciplinary journals in political science from 9/11 to 2016, 2,700 articles. Only 5 of them covered anything related to US intelligence. And since professors teach what they research, we don't have a lot of university courses on US intelligence either, which gives me the chance to show you one of my favorite slides. This one. So guess which U2 is taught by more of the top 25 universities in the United States? The answer is Bono and U2, the rock band, because I found there are more courses on the history of rock and roll taught in the top 25 than courses on US intelligence. So you can learn about U2, the band, much more easily than you can U2, the spy plane in elite universities today. So we have an education crisis, I think, in this country about intelligence. And it's one of the reasons I decided to write this book and then teach a course on intelligence here at Stanford in the spring quarter. So I'm going to just go through very quickly what intelligence is and what it isn't before I get to how everything is changing. Intelligence, just most simply, and many of my colleagues, I know you have lived this reality, it's information that gives policymakers decision advantage, right? Any kind of decision advantage, knowing what an adversary might want to push for at an upcoming summit, knowing whether a bridge up ahead is going to hold a tank or not. It's not a crystal ball. There's a lot more behind that about how most intelligence really is ambiguous, right? We know that Putin's tanks are on the border of Ukraine. The question is, what are his intentions? And that's much harder to discern, even for Putin himself. Intelligence is not policy, right? Intelligence is an input to policy. So when policymakers talk about intelligence failures in Afghanistan, it's a policy failure, our withdrawal from Afghanistan, not so much an intelligence failure. Public reports show the CIA was actually anticipating that the government in Kabul could fall and could fall quickly. So intelligence isn't policy, and it's not just secrets. It's never been just secrets. In a typical intelligence report, 80% of the information in it comes from publicly available information. So just to level set there about what intelligence is and what it isn't. So how is the world changing? Well, I talked a little bit ago about all of these emerging technologies, and I think we're standing at the cusp of a really unprecedented moment where we've never had so many technologies changing so much so fast. And this working group is really looking deeply into the intersection of technological change, the economic, and the geopolitical implications. So we're living in a moment where AI, for example, is transforming economics and the nature of work, and it's also transforming the security environment. What does that mean for intelligence agencies in the United States? And so what I argue is that we can think of the challenges as what I call the 5 mores. And I'll go through each in turn, but you can see them summarized on this slide. More threats, right? Technology is generating more threats, more speed at which those threats move, more data, which for intelligence analysts is particularly problematic, more decision makers who need intelligence that don't have security clearances and don't work in the government, and perhaps most importantly, more competitors like David Albright and Fabian Hines, checking out Iran's claims about what an industrial shed really is, right? Competitors to classified intelligence agencies. This is the picture is worth 1,000 words. On the left, what you see is the Soviets parading a missile through Red Square. That is a CIA reference photograph that was actually used during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Right? Back in the Cold War, it was a dangerous time, but it was very clear that we had one singular threat, and that was the Soviet Union. But thanks in large part to technologies, the threat landscape today is much more complex, it's much more crowded, and it's moving much more quickly. We've talked a lot in the working group so far about cyber threats and technology challenges. Cyber is giving our old adversaries like Russia new capabilities, and it's also unleashing new threats against the United States. You know, as we think about for most of our history, 2 things protected this country from external threats: our beneficial geography, the fact that we had these two vast oceans and good neighbors to the north and the south, and the fact that we were a great power. But those two things don't protect us in cyberspace. Geography doesn't matter in cyberspace like it does in physical space. We're all in bad neighborhoods in cyberspace. And we're also not just powerful in cyberspace, we're vulnerable in cyberspace. And that's new, right? Usually power and vulnerability don't go hand in hand quite like they do. And we've talked about this in the group too. Our freedom of speech makes us vulnerable to information warfare and polarization driven by external threats as well. So this is a dramatically different threat environment, and it's driven by technology. So that's the first more. And just to double down on this for a minute, I love this panoply of pictures because you can see how fast the cyber threat, just to take one of them, has changed in a decade. So if you can see the smiling men on one side of the slide are John Negroponte. I should add Ambassador Negroponte, Hoover National Security Affairs Fellow back in the day. So it's John Negroponte and then FBI Director Robert Mueller. And they're smiling, I think, because they haven't realized how serious cyber is as a threat yet. So every year, as you probably know, the Director of National Intelligence gives a public threat assessment to Congress, which you can read. And in 2007, that threat assessment did not include the word cyber at all. Cyber wasn't on the landscape at all. Fast forward 5 years, and there's Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta in his nice tuxedo on board the USS Intrepid, a former aircraft carrier turned museum, where he's warning of a cyber Pearl Harbor. In 2012, the thinking was that the major cyber threat against the country was one that created physical damage, right? Like damaging power grids. It was a physical attack like Pearl Harbor. And Panetta's standing on the Intrepid for a reason, right? That imagery of Pearl Harbor. Fast forward another 5 years, and boy, the threat looks really different. In the 2016 presidential election, we see that the Russians aren't just hacking machines, and they were hacking machines, they were hacking our minds, trying to influence and polarize American society and try to tilt the outcome of the presidential election. That's just 10 years. That's just one threat, moving from nowhere on the threat landscape to physical attacks to hacking our minds and information warfare, which leads to the second more, which is more speed, right? If we think about the speed of intelligence has to move at the speed of relevance. Decision makers need intelligence in time to do something about it. In the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, we know that President Kennedy had 13 days to deliberate in secret, to analyze intelligence from those U-2 surveillance planes and figure out what US policy was going to be. In 9/11, President Bush had 13 hours between the time of the first attacks to go over the intelligence, identify who was behind it, and formulate a US policy response, which he gave to the nation that night. 13 days in 1962 for intelligence to inform policy, 13 hours on 9/11 for intelligence to inform policy. But now in cyberspace, it's more like 13 minutes or 13 seconds, or maybe it's too late because we know often breaches are detected weeks or months after the bad guys are already rooting around your networks. So the speed at which intelligence has to move to inform policymakers is accelerating dramatically thanks to new technology. So we have more threats and more speed. And then there's the third more data, right? We are all drowning in data. Today, there are more people that have cell phones on Earth than running water. More than half the world is connected to the internet. We have an estimated 3,000 commercial satellites orbiting the Earth, and they're expected to dramatically increase to as much as 100,000 satellites within a decade or two. And just to give you one of the most incredible statistics I came across, the World Economic Forum found in 2019, internet users posted 500 million tweets, sent 300 billion emails, and posted 350 million photos to Facebook every day, right? That's not at the end of the year, that's every day. So it's an incredible amount of information that we're combating. And for intelligence officials who have to find needles in haystacks, what this means is the haystacks are growing out of control and they need help in figuring out how to make sense of all of this data in the world. And they need help with technological tools like AI to do it. So that's the third more, is more data. The fourth more, who counts as a decision maker today? Who needs intelligence to keep the country safe and advance our national interest? Well, it's not just people with security clearances anymore. Thanks to technology, lots of people outside of Washington now need intelligence. This picture, what you see here, the split screen, is 4 leaders who did what was pretty unusual at the time. It's a public service announcement about election integrity. And the very stern looking gentleman on the right is General Paul Nakasone. He's the director of National Security Agency and the commander of US Cyber Command. And for those of you who are steeped in intelligence history, you'll know that NSA the acronym used to be, the joke was it stood for no such agency. That's how secretive the NSA has historically been. And here they are now giving public service announcements about intelligence related to election interference. And that's because voters need intelligence in order to secure the vote. Tech leaders need intelligence about cyber threats to their platforms. Critical infrastructure leaders need intelligence about cyber threats that could take down the grid or compromise our financial services sector. So intelligence isn't just for customers inside the situation room anymore. It's for people inside boardrooms and living rooms. And that's a very different world for intelligence agencies to produce for the open, as opposed to just the classified environment. And we can talk about that. They're struggling to figure out how to do that well. And then there's the fifth more, which is the more competitors. And I've likened the open source intelligence world in nuclear threats to the Star Wars Cantina, because it's everybody from everywhere playing in this space. And fortunately, some of my friends in this world say they really like that analogy. They like being thought of as the Star Wars Cantina. What do I mean? I want to give you a little bit of a feel of what this world of open source intelligence folks looks like today. Here are 2 pictures of 2 of my favorite people in this world. The guy in the nice Stanford shirt standing on the Stanford campus is my colleague, Sig Hecker, the former director of Los Alamos National Lab. He's a physicist, and he used to have high-level security clearances, and now he does open source intelligence collection and analysis about nuclear threats, primarily focusing on North Korea and Iran. The guy on the right is also in this universe. His name is Jacob Bogle. He lives in Tennessee, and he's a coin dealer by day. He's a hobbyist by night, and he's been obsessively making great maps of North Korea. So I copied this from his website, and at the bottom you can see, and I love this about Jacob Bogle, his big 3, if you want to contact him, are North Korea, coins, and political consulting. So this really is the Star Wars Cantina of activists and hobbyists and journalists and profiteers and volunteers and everybody in between. They're all collecting and analyzing intelligence about the most secretive of intelligence challenges, nuclear threats. So if we take a step back and look a little more analytically, how does this emerging world compare to the classified intelligence world of the past? I want to go through a little bit what I mean. I'm not going to go through every point on the slide, but just to give you a feel for systematic differences between these 2 landscapes, right, and what they mean. In the OSINT, or open source intelligence community, there are lots of different motives that bring people to the table. Some people are picking their topics that they want to go into because they need grant money. And so that's driving them to focus on, say, North Korea instead of China, for example. Some people feel a responsibility about just being transparent and informing the public. Some people are just avid hobbyists. There's a wide range of motives driving people. This membership of this community is wide open to anyone, which is why it's the Wild West. All you need is an internet connection to join. There's no security clearance process for these folks. The backgrounds they bring are obviously much broader, from coin dealers to physicists. The quality control is ad hoc, and it's voluntary, and it's informal. There's no bureaucratic procedure for vetting information before it gets out in the wild. And the whole ecosystem moves very quickly, right? Remember at the beginning, David Albright, Fabian Hines, hours before their intelligence was out in the world and affecting a press conference of the leader of Israel. Compare that now to our lovely classified world of the intelligence community. Well, there, the motives are much more aligned. It's decision advantage, and people know that going in. There are narrower backgrounds that come through. Joining is hard. You have to go through a security clearance process, and it can take years to get your job and get in the door. Quality control is systematic. It may move slowly, but there are standard operating procedures for vetting information before it gets in the hands of policymakers. And it moves at the more plodding pace of a bureaucracy, right? Not that it's altogether bad, it's just a very different world. So what does it mean when these two worlds are now coming together? It's a good news, bad news story. So this open source ecosystem, and nuclear threats are just one element of them, the open source world provides more hands on deck, more people who can put their minds and their resources into analyzing challenges in nuclear threat detection. The second key benefit is that they offer information that can be shared. That's really important, because when something's classified, it gets marooned in different parts of the government and can't be shared as easily with other governments as well. So why does my colleague Sig Hecker prefer to work in the open source world? He wants to be able to share his information, and he thinks it makes for better policy within the US government. And they also bring more diverse perspectives when you have people with that many backgrounds. And, you know, I always think a joke is worth 1,000 words. And so, you know, the old saying about the optimist sees the glass as half full and the pessimist sees your glass as half empty. But if you're an engineer, you don't view it that way at all. For engineers, the glass is twice as large as it needs to be. Different perspectives can really help with your analysis, right? So, but it's not all good news. I promised the bad news story, and here's what it is. This open source community means that errors can go viral very quickly. And when that happens, and it has already happened, and we can talk about that with respect to China and its nuclear threats, when errors go viral, it saps the most important thing in Washington, time. So it can distract folks inside the intelligence community and lead policymakers to burn a lot of time and attention on wild goose chases because it happened to get into the open source ecosystem. The second risk is deliberate deception. Because this world is open to anyone, that means nefarious actors can inject deliberately deceptive information into this ecosystem in the hopes that it influences the classified world as well. The third error is countermeasure risk. So if an open source nuclear sleuth finds something, sometimes that can reveal to the adversary that their camouflage and concealment techniques weren't as good as they thought they were. So then they fix those, and the whole thing may be harder to track later on. Short-term revelation of what an adversary is doing through the open source world can make it long-term a harder target to track. And then finally, there's this question of how open source intelligence could influence crisis management. And just to put you in a hypothetical, imagine we're in the Cuban Missile Crisis and it's playing out on Twitter. And we get the tweet that I made up right at the bottom, which says, just in, new at peoplesat.com images show nuke missile sites in Cuba, hashtag crossing red lines. Imagine this is happening. And now you have these third-party open source detectives fact-checking what's really going on as the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolds. How bad could that be? Well, we know in the real Cuban Missile Crisis, there were two keys to success: secrecy and time to think. The 13 days, the negotiations in secret that resulted in a nuclear trade so secret, no one knew about it for 25 years, right? So Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed to trade removal of missiles. The Soviets would withdraw their missiles from Cuba. The US would withdraw our Jupiter missiles from Europe. But that deal was done completely in secret. It wasn't openness and speed that led to resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, quite the opposite. It was secrecy and time. So imagine now it plays out in this Twitter universe of open source intelligence. Kennedy has no time to think. His first choice on the first day of the crisis was an airstrike, which would likely have led to nuclear war. Now Khrushchev is backed into a corner, and so is Kennedy. Their secret negotiations become much more challenging to do because they're facing public pressure. I think it's fair to say that nuclear war risk in this scenario actually goes up, not down. So when everything becomes more transparent, it makes it harder for sides in a crisis to find gracious exits and to back down and to de-escalate. So just to look ahead, what are the implications of this new world of intelligence? What I find is that our intelligence community has to be radically reimagined now after 20 years of fighting the war on terror to better understand emerging technologies and to better use emerging technologies to assess intelligence. And I've written on this slide a few things about how we should start to think about the challenges that we need. How can our intelligence agencies use open source intelligence better? How can they work with open source intelligence people like Jacob Bogle and David Albright and Fabian Hines better? And how can they understand the emerging technologies of us and our adversaries better than we do today? And the key levers that I find that I think we need to focus on are, we need a technology strategy for intelligence. Second, we need an organization that focuses on open source intelligence because it's not going to happen inside secret agencies. And we need to focus on people at the end of the day. It's a war for talent and intelligence. I'm going to stop there, and I really look forward to hearing your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jamie. It was a terrific overview, and in summary, it gets us all thinking about what's wrong and how to fix it. I want to actually just have a little quote from your book, if you don't mind. There are no easy answers, but one imperative is already evident. American intelligence agencies must adopt or they will fail. There's a pretty, and you have good discussions of the reasons for that. But when I think about that, I also think about another side of this coin, which this technology is very beneficial. And it's huge. I mean, it potentially makes everybody in the world know what's going on in the US, good things, technology. Anyway, we're technology, economics, and governance is. So that's a second thing. How do you make the remedy without interfering with the good aspects? Because there are many good aspects of this technology communication. So it's a quick question to get us started. I see Jackie has a question next, but go ahead, Amy.
I look forward to hearing what Jackie has to say too, but thanks, John. And I love that you always remind me that it's not all doom and gloom, that we should look at the bright side of technology and not just the dark side. So I think technology is the answer too, right? And so one of the challenges, and we've talked about this, is that in the current moment, technological innovations are coming from the private sector, not the government. And the government has to figure out how to bring them in. It used to be the opposite. Technology innovations started in the government and then they were commercialized and monetized like the internet. And so we're still not very good at figuring out how to bring those innovations in from places like Silicon Valley into the government. I think when we have so many different innovation units spread across the Pentagon and the intelligence community, it tells you that they can't innovate. The more innovation units you need, the more the real bureaucracy isn't doing its job. And so that's kind of the big bottleneck, is how do we get the goodness of these emerging technologies like machine learning and make sure that the government isn't the last place where they get used. And so I think that's where we can do a lot of good at Hoover in bringing these communities together.
Thank you. Jackie.
Well, Amy, I am so excited about this book. It is, such a tremendous, wonderful book. I not everyone here might know, but I used to be an intelligence officer, and my first job was sitting the watch in South Korea, and this was in the early 2000s. And the North Koreans were just starting their missile program, so we were actively tracking, the taepodongs and the Scuds, and using every piece of very, very technical, very, very classified intelligence to try and understand what they were doing. And then you'd go home and you'd turn on CNN, and CNN had these Google Earth images of what was happening. And it was shocking at the time, because here we thought we had the monopoly on this information. And I think that trend has only continued, especially in the cyber world, where states used to have maybe not a monopoly, but they definitely had more information than the commercial or the public sector. And so they were able to use information as a strategic asset, when to reveal, when to not reveal, when to attribute, when to not attribute. And so, like a lot of the intelligence literature, what it focuses on is the politicization of that information, not necessarily, well, what happens when the state no longer has that monopoly to be able to decide when and how it wants to reveal private information. And so I was interested in your study, how you saw that shift changing between, the state owning information to private sector. And then how do you think that ends up affecting crisis stability and the ability of states to use information to try and bargain with each other?
So first of all, such a great anecdote, Jackie, about your experience as an intelligence officer. And I look forward to seeing your new book coming out as soon as it's done. Such a great question. I wanted to just add a little bit of color to how sophisticated the commercial capabilities are. So I looked this up just this week. So a commercial satellite company named Maxar has the highest resolution imagery available today. It is 15 centimeters. What does that mean? It means that if you have two objects on Earth that are 6 inches apart, this satellite can tell what they are from space. That kind of resolution was unheard of in the commercial sector 10 years ago. It's something that only spy satellites could give you. So this is now the kind of thing that's available to just about everyone, right? So that is really changing the game. Jackie, in answer to your question, it's something I'm still thinking about, but here's my first take, and I'd love to get your reaction, which is that my sense is the intelligence community is looking at open source intelligence as stuff. It's more stuff that they need to bring in the door for analysts to dig through. And what they need to be thinking about is it's not just stuff. It's a whole ecosystem of players that operates according to its own dynamics. And what they need to figure out is, how do they engage in that ecosystem? How do they direct that ecosystem to their own advantage? And how do they protect that ecosystem from being manipulated by our adversaries? And so I think they need to shift the lens. I don't get the sense that they're there yet, but you talk a lot with folks inside the community. I'd be curious to know what you found.
Well, I found that they take open source intelligence and put a QE on it. That's the new classification that says it's government information. So, I mean, I think what I have noticed is that there's no strategy for what if this information is revealed before we can deal with it. And so they act as if they have all the time to deliberate and figure out what to do with the information. But the reality is it's coming from the public far before they've had any strategy about releasing the information in an advantageous way.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a growing industry about how do we think strategically about when to reveal and when to conceal and how to respond when other people force our hand. I think for, how many decades have we had the luxury of being able to decide that without being pressured by sort of third party as opposed to a state adversary. And I think that's going to be a growth industry. At least I hope it will be, because we need to think through it.
So don't forget to raise your hand if you have questions, but I have lots. So let me actually just fast forward to yesterday. We had you have a chapter on covert actions. It's a very interesting, puzzling chapter to know how to deal with. But we had apparently a covert action yesterday and in ISIS in Syria. And I don't know if you can relate that at all to your chapter or other things about what should be known, what shouldn't be known. Anything would be helpful on that, Amy.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up, John. So, one of the good things about our post 9/11 reforms is that we have this tight integration between intelligence and military action, particularly counterterrorism. And we saw that play out just this week with this action against ISIS. That's the good news. Right. The bad news is now we've hardwired our intelligence system to do exactly that and not a lot else. So in my excerpt that I wrote in Politico, I talked a little bit more about how, intelligence and the military are related, but they have different functions. That military officers are hunters. Intelligence officers are gatherers. Right? Military officers are trained in the use of violence. Intelligence officers are trained in the use of information. And the more the CIA in particular is brought into that supporting paramilitary action, whether it's covert or overt on the ground, the less the CIA can do its primary mission, which is preventing strategic surprise, keeping warfighters off the battlefield to begin with. You can't do it all. And so one senior intelligence official said to me, I wonder if we had spent the amount of time on China that we did on counterterrorism meetings every week, would we be in a better position today? And I think he was on to something there, that it's, and understandable reasons why we focused on the war on terror, but there was an opportunity cost there. See, I smuggled in my economics for you, John. There's an opportunity cost there of really, not being able to focus strategically on the China threat.
I have a lot of economics questions, but Jim Timby and David Goldfein after Jim.
Thank you, John. And thank you, Amy. That's really fascinating subject. I mean, you talk about open source. That is that the information collected is open, it's unclassified. But when you start to do assessments for that information, don't those become sensitive? Don't you get into stuff that maybe you don't want to share? So how does that work out, where you have unclassified information, but then you draw assessments, you draw conclusions, which maybe you don't want to share. Maybe you have proprietary processes dealing with open information. How do you put all that together?
Well, thanks so much for that question, Jim. It's such an important consideration for intelligence. And I know there are folks who have lived in this world much more than I have. So intelligence has always, as you know, Jim, married the open source with the classified stuff. And it's that combination, that marriage of them that often gives insight. But even for, even when you have only open source intelligence, the synthesis of it, the insight derived from it could be really valuable, and it could and should be classified in many instances. So just because it started in the open doesn't mean it should stay in the open. But the flip side is also a problem. And Director Haynes, DNI Haynes, talked about this just last week, the overclassification of information and how much that is impeding the effectiveness of our government, including the intelligence community. I thought that was a remarkable statement by the sitting DNI. People have long talked about it in private conversations and once they're out of office about how there's overclassification. But for our current DNI to talk about how serious a problem this is, I think was really important. I think it's a big problem. So I worry more about overclassification than underclassification.
Thank you, Amy. David, go ahead. David.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Great topic, great book. Good to see you again. Two opportunities I want to ask you about that we discussed a lot in the tank when I was a Joint Chief in terms of opportunities here. One is when you have a combination of classified and open source, how do you actually merge the two that can increase the confidence level of what you're looking at? That was opportunity number one. And the number two is, you know, when we do it right, we as a nation don't go it alone, we go with allies and partners. And as we all know, sharing information with them has become harder over the years, not easier. But open source is often easily shareable because you're not concerned about sources or methods. So any thoughts on the opportunities here to be better coalition teammates with the information we get from open source? Thanks.
Well, General Goldfein, it's so nice to have you here. It's great to see you again. And I think you could run this seminar better than I could. I'll take a stab at the great questions you just asked. Absolutely, the sharing is not just important for within the US government, but between our partners and allies. And I think we're seeing that. I'd be curious to know your take on the revelations of China's nuclear missile silos over the summer, which the government may have known about ahead of time, but it became public through open source means and carried in, you know, the front pages of the news in the Washington Post and New York Times. And, you know, the attribution was to open source researchers. And I think that was enabled that information to be shared. And the implications for our partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific was important and an important component of that. So I think that sharing potential of intelligence in the open source world is crucial. But I'd be curious to know your answer to the first question, which is the confidence level, and whether you could share anything about how that played out actually in your time in government.
Yeah, really quickly, but I don't want to take your time. The example that I often offer in terms of the importance of this topic is we all remember when the Russians shot down the Malaysian airliner. We actually found the intelligence that proved that they did it on a Russian blog site through exactly what you said with the timestamp. 1 month after the shot, 1 month late. What would have happened if we'd had that hours or minutes after the shot to put in front of the UN? That's the power of this intelligence. If we can only get access to it and we have the confidence level very quickly that allows us to use it.
That's a great example.
John Deutch, please go ahead.
Well, I want to salute you, Professor Zegart, for not only writing this book, but also your teaching about this subject and bringing this subject to greater awareness of students at Stanford and elsewhere. So I salute you for that. It's very important, and it's not done sufficiently broadly. For example, my own institution, MIT, does not have a course on intelligence. So you would be welcome there at any time. I just want to say that. But I thought I would offer a few comments that haven't come up here directly. First, we have a division in our organization, which goes back for 50 years, between domestic and foreign intelligence. And evidently, in the world you're talking about, that distinction has no sense, and it leads to vulnerabilities, as we've seen, directly into our own country. So the division between national security and law enforcement has got to go away, or you're never going to make this system work properly. That's my first point. And my second point is, it's not only collecting information, whether it's open source or clandestine, it's also doing careful analysis by people who are equipped and have the time to think. And they aren't only technical people, they are also social scientists, and even regrettably economists. So you have to integrate social science into this process. And that does take some experience and care. And finally, I want to say there are two things that trouble me that you haven't touched on at all. The first is the oversight of intelligence, and the oversight for intelligence has for many years laid with the US Congress. And I personally believe that it is completely broken down, that the system no longer works. We no longer have responsible and, if you don't mind my saying so, nonpartisan oversight from either the Senate or the House. And that, I think, is a very great danger. And frankly speaking, more a result of the Democratic side of the House than the Republican side of the House. And my second point is, and I could give you a unfortunate and sad story about the creation of the Office of National Intelligence, and we now have a Director of National Intelligence. Is that a plus or a minus in the world that you see? And I must tell you, from my perspective, that's, of course, I was a Director of Central Intelligence, not a mere Director of CIA, and nor a great Director of National Intelligence. But I will tell you, I think that it has been folly, and it makes most of the community worry about what's happening inside of Washington, D.C., rather than outside. But thank you again for your contributions here. And Mr. Chairman, I hope I haven't spoken too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Your perspective is very valuable. Amy?
Well, Dr. Deutch, it's just so great to have you here. It's really an honor to have you here, and also to say that you support political science and even economics in the course of education. I really appreciate that. You raised great points, all of them. Let me take them in reverse order. I testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee when they were debating about the DNI, cautioning that the creation of a DNI was a bad idea whose time had come. Right. And by that, I meant whenever there's a crisis, the natural response is let's create a new organization. And you have lived this, sir, at CIA. And when the chief challenge is coordination, the last thing you want to do is create yet another organization to coordinate them all. And so it struck me, at least from the outside looking in, that in that legislation, they replicated all of the original failures of the 1947 National Security Act that created the CIA in the first place. I'd be curious to know what you think. The CIA director never had control over the budget, over all the other agencies, or control over the people. And so it was a responsibility for the community without authority over the community. And we had the same thing with the DNI. I'll stop there and see if
Mr. Chairman, if I could just make a comment about this. I did testify in front of the 3 Mile Island Commission just after my boss, Jim Schlesinger, did. And I was in favor of the legislation because I thought that the legislation would give a new Director of National Intelligence authority over the budgets and the planning. Jim Schlesinger almost beat me physically, saying that was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard, because when it gets in the hands of Congress, it won't come out the way it should be. It'll come out some completely different way. So it's to my mind, a massive mistake, and one which just is in fact going to stop the world from going as quickly in the directions that you have pointed out to, about taking account of going faster, looking more widely, and integrating.
Yeah. Well, let me see if I can touch on your 2 other terrific points about oversight. I have a whole chapter bemoaning congressional oversight that will make your heart sing.
Oversight is absolutely vital, but it has to be done like it was done in the old days, not where you have individual senators or congressmen making political speeches.
Absolutely. And so part of what
it's chapter 8. So get a copy and read chapter 8. It's all about this.
And so the question I ask, because I think the narrative is that oversight goes up and down depending on who's in the committees and who's in the White House. And what I find is a more depressing story, that oversight has always struggled. It has always been too weak. It has always been hurting effectiveness, and in some cases accountability, because members of Congress don't have incentives to oversee the intelligence community, and they don't have the institutional mechanisms to do so well either. And so, one of the reasons we see so much more partisanship in the House today than the Senate is, other than the obvious fact that the House is more partisan than the Senate, is that the committee is structured in a way to exacerbate partisanship. And, I know, sir, you've lived this experience, but with a disproportionate majority of the majority party on the committee and term limits for members, which means just when they get to become experts about the acronyms, they have to get off the committee. So this partisanship problem has been around for a while. I take some solace that the Senate is more bipartisan in intelligence oversight than the House. But oversight has always been problematic because voters don't reward members of Congress for doing oversight of intelligence.
Remember that my beloved Senator Feinstein allowed there to be a democratic release of a study on enhanced interrogation that blew the system up. There had never been a partisan study of that kind put out by one party before.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So I talk about that in the book too. So this is, the dubbed the torture report. And it was so unfortunate how that investigation went because it began as a bipartisan investigation. And then the Republicans lost confidence in that investigation as it proceeded. And as I said, when you lose Susan Collins, you're doing something wrong, right? She's a middle of the road, thoughtful person. And I think the key problem with that investigation, were many key problems, but they never interviewed anybody. And there was a moral sort of campaign about what the Democrats felt was an immoral program, but they couched it in terms of efficacy. And that was, I think, a real mistake. So I agree with you about that report. I thought it was very unfortunate. I wrote about it and got an earful from Senator Feinstein when I talked about the unforced errors of the process by which that investigation was produced.
And one final point, I think that your article in Politico on saying that the CIA should not be doing military work, should not be doing, not covert action we're not speaking about now, but we're talking about paramilitary operations, that is entirely right. And when I was Deputy Secretary of Defense, I thought it was insane at that time also.
Well, that's glad to hear. And I'm glad to hear that I'm welcome at MIT since I have a son in graduate school there. So I can embarrass him by teaching classes at MIT.
I don't believe that. I don't believe, I thought I wanted that fact check there.
So one other thing that Mr. Deutch mentioned is the inapplicability of domestic versus foreign in this, the FBI, CIA, et cetera. And maybe that's a reason why you need to have a change in operations or give up on the distinction. I don't know, but it's there. It's very important. So you have any thoughts on that, Amy?
So this is something that, that I talked with the National Counterterrorism Director, Christy Abizade, about, right? So this is a real challenge, the domestic foreign divide. So NCTC, I think, was one of the improvements after 9/11. I don't know if Dr. Deutch would agree with me on that. Maybe not. We'll have to arm wrestle over that. But this question of, data doesn't respect borders. So how do we deal with a world where threats are crossing borders and data is crossing borders seamlessly, but our intelligence agencies can't? It doesn't make a lot of sense to have a lot of those rigid barriers. Now, bear in mind, I fully recognize we have to protect civil liberties. That's really important. But we have to find a better middle ground than what we have. And I think about the brouhaha about NSA warrantless wiretapping programs. And the reality was, before 9/11, there was a seam, the foreign domestic seam, where we couldn't actually intercept communications where there was one suspected terrorist in the United States communicating with other suspected terrorists abroad. So there were reasons why we needed to close that seam, but that kind of got lost in the conversation. But now, as John, you and I have talked about, private sector firms have all sorts of access to our data and can do whatever they want with it in a way that we really need to better understand and have to have more guardrails around.
Oh, I agree. I think we're just about out of time. Let me just say one thing. I think the economics are important. And that's why it's in the title of Technology, Economics, and Governance, if you don't mind. I went to maybe 100 meetings, maybe 200 meetings in Situation Room. I was the only one that raised the economics. They said, oh, there goes Taylor again, talk about the economics. So anyway, Amy, thank you so much. It's terrific. And we'll all go out and buy the book.
John, thank you so much for inviting me to do this. And thanks to all of you for coming.